Hi, Thomas.
Here we are.
Hello, we're here. Finally got there.
better living through modern technology.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. I don't know. There's sometimes I think I could do without it, eh?
That's true.
So I gave up my cell phone about 6 months ago, and I do not miss it at all. I
very rarely use mine. In fact, I have one of those old, well, they're considered old-fashioned now, the razor phones.
Oh, yeah.
You know, which was the biggest thing when it came out, and now it's, most of these young people look at it like it's some sort of an abacus or a...
antique.
An Etch-a-Sketch, yeah.
Okay, well, Thomas, just to let you know, my interviews are very relaxed, and I've read through your press pack, and I read a little bit about you and your work already when you first got in touch. So, for me, you got in touch with me, and what I normally find is people who get in touch with me normally have very strong ideas and messages that they're very keen to communicate. So I am not as strong in the scientific physics side, and I wouldn't presume to ask you questions thinking that I would know if you were giving me a correct answer or not. So really, my suggestion would be, let's start off with you and your personal journey, as much as obviously you're willing to talk about it. I understand you don't go into your personal life, but you must have had some significant experiences that have brought you to a point where you're talking about this subject matter, which is very, very interesting.
Yes. You know, as many people who get involved and pursue these types of alternative or outside of the mainstream fields of interest, I too had some very profound parapsychological experiences back in my teens and early 20s, which caused me to call into question the model of reality that was taught to me in standard physics. And so for me, rather than going into an experiential or a practicing aspect of these things, the compelling question for me was what kind of a universe would allow all these things to occur? How is the universe put together so that these things could happen? And so this is where, you know, I devoted my research and focus is to come up with a model of reality that not only incorporates conventional scientific findings, but also accommodates what we would consider the supernatural or the paranormal as well.
Okay. Now, the supernatural and paranormal, that's, you know, a very broad label. Let's talk about what theoretically that is and what you mean it is.
Well, yeah, that's a good question, because there's a lot of different definitions that people consider for these areas. For me, one of the early things I encountered in my work was to realize that I had to come up with some very definite ways to define certain terms and ideas that would also be scientifically consistent. And so ultimately what I came up with is the idea that everything that would be considered paranormal or quote-unquote supernatural would be observable phenomena, which would actually be physical effects, because if they weren't physical, they could not be observed, but had no directly connected, locally connected physical cause. A good example would be in paranormal hauntings, where sometimes people encounter what we would call a disembodied voice. Well, what's normal about that voice is that it is acting in the same way as a normal voice physically, and that there is a vibration, there's a compression wave that is vibrating the air column, the air molecules that are surrounding the source, and that air carries the vibrations as a medium to your ears or to the microphone of a recorder, and course, that's translated into sound. What distinguishes a normal voice from a paranormal voice is in a normal voice, there's a set of vocal cords that is locally in direct physical contact with the air column that causes that air column to vibrate. In a paranormal voice or a disembodied voice, there is no local physical cause connected to the air column to cause it to vibrate. And so when we look at paranormal and supernatural phenomena, to me, the scientific definition in which they all fall is what physics calls non-local causality or non-locality, which is a physical effect with no direct observable physical cause connected to it. When we take a look at paranormal and supernatural events in this way, we find out that we are then able to break down the barrier, the conceptual barrier, that normally separates these fields from conventional science and physics, so that we can say that everything across the board, every effect that we see across the board, which is observable but has no directly observable physical cause connected to it, would be paranormal. So in this case, elements of physics like quantum mechanics or quantum entanglement would actually be a paranormal phenomenon. As well, believe it or not, as certain aspects of the, of the property or the effect of gravity. And so by looking at it this way, we not only get a firm scientific foundation, but we're able to break down some of the traditional barriers to separate various disciplines.
Okay. Now, this is something that's still a bit of a contentious area, particularly for people who are of a monotheistic belief system. There is no question, obviously, in your mind as to the existence of paranormal activities, etc., that is going on. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it would be much more, much more unlikely or improbable that all of these kinds of experiences and observations recorded over a period of centuries, if not millennia, were all due to hallucinations or misidentification of known phenomena or outright, lying or misrepresenting. Yes, I don't think there's any question.
Okay, absolutely. So this, as I said, this is contentious for people, obviously, of sort of a religious belief. How do you go about explaining this to them without trampling on their ideologies? I mean, if you really want to try and get this information over to somebody.
Well, I think what you're talking about is a religious prejudices.
Yeah.
Perhaps, against things like paranormal phenomena. Like if you go there, you're going to sail off the edge of the world, or here be monsters.
Exactly, yeah.
Like that. Well, the idea is this, how would I phrase it? If we have events that are observable that would be considered miraculous or supernatural, that they have to be working according to a set of laws and principles. These things just don't simply happen randomly of themselves. They are following a set of principles and laws which govern the greater creation or the greater universe. And if that's the case, and if there is a God creator, then that creator created a universe in which these types of events can occur. So if we take an example, let's talk about Judeo-Christianity for a minute. And let's think about the account with Moses and Aaron back at the court of Pharaoh in Egypt, where Moses was petitioning the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. And in one occurrence, the court magicians and Aaron threw down his staff, and it turned into a snake. And the court magicians threw down their wooden staffs, and they turned into snakes as well. And of course, we know, as the account goes, the larger snake from Aaron's staff consumed the snakes from the magician's staff. But if we take away for a moment, if we set aside the idea of morality, I'm not saying that that's not a legitimate consideration. By no means. The spiritual and moral aspects of these events are important. But when we set those aside for a second, or what I say, remove the criminology for a moment, and just look at the forensics, the process by which a piece of wood can be transformed into a living serpent would be identical in both instances. You know, God would not be setting up two different sets of principles and physics, so to speak, so that the one and the other occur by completely different symptoms or systems. Both of those transformations occur by the same laws and principles which govern the greater universe. It's just the same idea that a baseball bat can be used as a game or as a, you know, for a game, or it can be used as a murder weapon. The physics of the bat and what it does when you swing it and it hits something is no different for one or the other. You can, you know, a mother can dissolve a fruit mix, an instant fruit mix in a glass of water for her children, or a criminal, a murderer, can dissolve poison in the water to kill somebody. But the idea that the water is a solvent doesn't change. Its physical, its chemical properties aren't different just because something different is being done with it.
That is a very interesting analogy indeed. Okay, all right, now that makes it a bit clearer. So, obviously you say there's rules and laws that have to sort of exist and bind and involve everything in existence, even what we can't tangibly perceive with our five sense reality as we know it. Then this is obviously where your theories of supergeometry come in, where you explain this from a sort of physics and scientific geometric point of view. Let's talk about that.
Okay. I believe that one of the main, if not the major obstacle in our modern thinking that prevents us from really understanding the nature of reality on a very fundamental and realistic level has to do with our paradigms. It doesn't necessarily have to do with a lack of information, a lack of acquired data, or a lack of reasoning abilities to figure it out. It has to do with the way that we view reality and the way that science also views reality. One of the examples that I use in my book, Mal, is that I talk about the phenomena of earthquakes and volcanoes and even mountain formation. For centuries, the processes behind these things were mysterious. Now, we picked up little bits and pieces of information. We certainly knew very much about the physical characteristics of the effect itself. Lava, you know, how fast it might come out, how hot it was, what it does, what volcanoes do when they blow up, so on and so forth. But we didn't understand the underlying principle until we came up with the paradigm of continental drift and plate tectonics. And once we understood that, suddenly all the information and the data that we had suddenly all came together like a magical puzzle and fit together. And we could understand the cause of volcanoes and the cause of earthquakes and how they were related. And we could even figure out easily how mountains were formed. So much so that a young school child can very easily understand this concept with that paradigm, whereas before it thwarted and puzzled some of the greatest minds in science. And so this is what I feel is missing in our reckoning with the universe. So
it's this basic knowledge of how it works that either it's been forgotten or it's withheld from us at school, or they just don't want us to know?
Well, I'll be perfectly honest. I think it just has never been identified before.
Okay.
And I believe that I've identified that paradigm. One of the things in modern science that's well accepted today is the idea that all matter and energy in the universe comprises information. This principle is so well established now that modern physics has created an extension to the old conservation laws that we all know that says matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. The modern extension of that is called quantum unitarity. And what it essentially says is that the information from which matter and energy is assembled itself can neither be created nor destroyed. Some of the problems that we have with various models, theoretical models of astronomical bodies that we call black holes, is the fact that under those models, information is destroyed, and it violates that cosmic principle. What I have come to believe is that it is not just simply another aspect of reality to look at it from this principle, but this principle of information is actually the primary fundamental concept of reality. I look at it like the Great Pyramid of Giza. There's 2 million blocks in it. Imagine if we discovered it, but instead of being fully assembled, it was all strewn about on the plains of Giza. And imagine further that we did not have any other pyramids in the world by which we could compare them to see how it was all put together. Imagine these stones being the various different aspects of reality: biology, electromagnetism, psychology, philosophy, all different kinds of aspects of reality. And at each stone where you would look, or you would stand as an observer and perceive the relative layout of what's in front of you, every single one of those stones would give you a unique perspective on the components of reality and their relationships with each other. But there's one stone in the whole conglomeration that makes all the difference in the world if you stand and look at the rest of it from that point. And that stone is the capstone. In the Pyramid of Giza, it was allegedly a 36 square foot pyramid shaped cap. And some people say it was made of solid gold.
Yeah.
Now, when you look at it from that perspective, suddenly all the other blocks fall in underneath of it. You can begin to figure out how the model is put together as a whole. And for me, that capstone is this. My definition of the universe is that it is an expression of materialized and materializing information. And when you look at it that way, suddenly, not only do you see how this relates to standard physics and standard physical observations, but you can also see it in terms of emerging paranormal phenomena, like ghost apparitions and disembodied voices, are simply materialisms of coherent information. When you look at parapsychology and things like telepathy, ESP, remote viewing, it becomes very easy to see how we're looking at a process of materializing information. And suddenly everything begins to click together.
Yes, indeed. Now, as you say that, it's starting to click together for me, because you know how they say if something terrible happens in an environment, like you walk in, you can feel there's a bad vibe. That is because all matter, as you say, is information. So is, they've discovered this with water. Masaru Emoto's very clearly does some great experiments where, messages can be carried in water. So this is obviously very apparently clear and true for me, what you're saying. So this makes more sense now how hauntings and things would come about, because certain things would be imprinted through information onto the environment, be it the material environment or just the space. Is that correct?
Yes, and when we look at this, and again, Mel, the important breakthrough in this is not necessarily the idea that everything comprises information. It's the idea of considering that to be the fundamental primary paradigm of physical reality, that it is actually the capstone. Right? When you begin to look at the universe as an expression of materialized information, things begin to start making sense. The veil begins to lift, as I say. For example, one of the things that we understand then is that all order that we see in the universe is comprised of an organized collection of the same information. We talk about, you mentioned something about voices being transmitted through water. Water is an intelligent structure. It is assembled according to that exact same single set of laws and principles, as well as the vocalized information being transmitted through it. And then when we think further, let's think about the human brain. The human brain is a physical object. Its very convolutions and the very way that it operates, even down to kinds of esoteric ideas like imagination and consciousness, all of that must be working according to the exact same laws and principles which assembled everything else in the universe. So consequently, when we hear a voice, or we look at a tree, for example, the reason why our human brain recognizes these as sensible, organized structures that are meaningful is that they are made from the very set of laws and principles which shape the very convolutions of our physical brain. It's almost as our brain recognizes those patterns of information outside of itself that the brain itself is constructed and configured according to.
Okay, well, would this be then why, as we become more sort of, and I hate to use the cliche, awake and aware, when we start to learn more things through research, through going onto the internet, it kind of feels more like we recognizing things, not or re-knowing things, as opposed to learning it for the first time.
Yes, what I believe is this, and I think that the evidence, again, looking at it from this kind of paradigm, the evidence is very compelling, and the argument is very compelling for the idea that the human brain is built upon the same principles. There's a component of it that also reflects the very same way that the universe is made. If we think about this, if we look about this not only religiously, but also what we accept today in science, that the universe was a true creation. It was something that arose out of no thing or nothing. The modern concept of the creation is the Big Bang. And physicists say that this Big Bang began with what they call a singularity that was infinitely dense and infinitely small. Well, there's nothing in the physical universe that carries a quality or a value of infinity. In fact, when theoretical physicists are working their calculations, they come up with a solution of infinity. They know they've done something wrong, or there's something missing out of the calculation. So what this tells us is that the universe was materialized by an intrinsic order that pre-existed it. That this order is beyond the physical and above the physical, and yet it can emerge as a materialized physical reality. Now, using that same paradigm, let's go back again and take a look at the human brain. What does the human brain do? Look around us. Everybody who's listening in the audience, look around at yourself. Look at the clothing you're wearing, the seat you're sitting on, the table you're sitting at, the computer, the telephone. All of these objects, none of these things occur in nature. But essentially what they are materializations of information devised in the human brain. So, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm chuckling because this is also good. It's brilliant. And it makes perfect sense, Thomas. Absolutely. And
it's that paradigm, Mel, that makes the difference when you stand at that capstone and begin to look at all the other pieces of reality from that particular perspective. Suddenly, everything begins to make sense.
Completely, completely. So now, obviously, there's a deep spiritual understanding from your side, clearly, very obvious. You say that there is some kind of pre-existing order of things. Can you extrapolate a bit more on that?
Yes, Mel, this, of course, most people who have studied into these things are familiar with this. This is a very, very old idea. I think it was first devised as sort of a kind of scientific idea by Plato. He called it forms. He said that all the structures in the universe were the result of these extra-physical forms or structures. If we take a look at the Judeo-Christian Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Jewish part of it, it talks about the wisdom of God, which serves this exact same purpose, that the wisdom of God is what it says the artificer, the constructor of all things, but itself is not physical. It predated the physical. In the New Testament, we look at the first paragraph of the Gospel of John. John uses a Greek word, logos, which has no exact English equivalent. It means form, structure, order, matrix, thought, idea. It's the same kind of a concept, so that, and we translate it in English as word, capital W-O-R-D. So the idea was that there was this pre-physical substance, which the Bible calls formless matter, and all was darkness, and then God spoke the word, the order. He emitted that structure. Most English translations say, let there be light. I think some of the archaic translations where it says, be light made, or just simply light is probably more accurate. And as soon as that order came forth, that formless matter materialized in a physical reality according to an order and structure. If we look at a modern, let's look in the 20th century, we have physicist David Bohm, one of the most prominent physicists in the 20th century, introducing an idea called implicate order. And he said implicate order was not physical, but it gave rise to the explicate order of the physical reality of time, space, matter, and energy. Physicist David Finkelstein has his own version of it. He calls it coherent superpositions, which are mathematically expressible, by the way. John Wheeler, another prominent physicist, called it pre-geometry. If we take a look at the parapsychological end, we have Edgar Cayce, who called it the Akasha. So this is the concept. It's a very old one. My particular form that I dish up is called supergeometry, because I believe not only the term with the prefix super is much more consistent scientifically with the way science normally classifies superstructures or supersets of something else, but also the term geometry gives a human mind some sort of a tangible feeling that you can sort of kind of wrap your head around of what this means, rather than some of these nebulous and ambiguous philosophical terms. The difference in my work is this, is that I say that the existence of this order immediately leads to two other questions. One is, where does this order come from, which is part of what we've been talking about. And the other thing, which has always been missing, is how can this information materialize in the physical reality? And it's that process of materialization of this super physical information that is the heart of my theory.
This is some of the most interesting information I've come across, Thomas. So I'm absolutely blown away by this. Okay, so you've looked at this as supergeometry. Okay, does this go into obviously the whole New Agey sacred geometry aspect?
Well, I've had that mentioned to me before, asked me before with sacred geometry, and I've taken a look at it, tried to study into it a little bit, and there are certain ideas in it which are similar to this. But the concept that I'm talking about really doesn't fall into sacred geometry.
Okay.
It's much bigger than that. It relates to every single order and structure that's in the universe itself. One of the examples that I give is that two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom combined in a molecule under standard temperature and pressure in the presence of a sufficient gravitational field to gather those molecules together into a pool will create a clear liquid that we call water. Anywhere in the universe those conditions are present and together. This is way beyond what, sacred geometry is talking about. This is the actual fabric of the order of creation itself.
Okay. You mentioned earlier Edgar Cayce and the Akasha. Now, it's a concept I've always had of what sort of the Akashic records are, is that ultimately, and going back to what we were saying earlier, is that all knowledge is ultimately knowable to us on some level. We have it imprinted within our very fibre of our being, whether it's our DNA, whether it's our sort of etheric body. It's tappable to all of us, isn't it? It's all there to be accessed, isn't it?
Well, again, according to my model and the paradigm that I'm proposing, is that everything of the human being, every different aspect of the human being, including the physical brain, and you'll notice what I do is I stay away as much as I can from words like consciousness and words like mind, and concentrate on the physical brain, because those other things are byproducts or results of the physical brain. The very same order and structure in which all information, again, information being used and understood by a human brain is knowledge. But knowledge is a very specific definition for the broader term information. All the universe is comprised from the same ordered and structured body of information. So when you have an intelligent human brain, a brain, which is a physical object that operates in such a way where it understands and perceives and is able to assimilate and actually apply those laws and principles, we understand that this is the reason why everything within the confined limits of the physical human brain, because it is a part of the universe, it's contained within the universe can never be contained within it, so it can never know everything. But within its limitations and within its confines, yes, every aspect of that body of information, that akasha, that implicate order, is ultimately quote-unquote knowable.
Huh. Extraordinary. So, people now coming into this awareness and this kind of information, and again, I'll also not use the word becoming conscious, because I guess we are always conscious, some more than others. But people coming to this point now and coming to understand this information, what is the practical application for them in their daily lives?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I get asked that sometimes because certainly there's a greater, how would you say it, a greater curiosity in most people for how to, rather than just a curiosity that would be satisfied by knowing what is. How to, personally, I think that it reaps a few benefits. Number one, it gives a solid, scientifically relevant and reasonable foundation for traditional religious beliefs. It gives us something more than just blind relief or belief, to come to the understanding that we are something more than just intelligent animals. That within our brains, within our makeup, is the actual capability of materializing invisible information into physical reality. And in that way, we mimic the exact same process that came into the universe, or made the universe come into being. This is not just something that's a philosophical or a metaphysical or, a religious belief. We've now brought it into the realm of arguable scientific fact. We are more than just intelligent animals. We are not only creative beings, because we can create, as for what I'm saying, but that creative faculty within ourselves is built in the very same image as the creative intelligence that brought the very universe into being. This brings it out of the argument, like I said, of just simply religious belief or philosophy or metaphysics. This brings this into a very sound, irrefutable scientific argument.
Yes, and I think that's important for people, because if nothing else, whether it be right or wrong, people have been very much indoctrinated or educated into believing that there is a scientific prerequisite or requirement to understanding absolutely everything. And to be honest with you, not everything can be defined under the scientific realm.
That is correct. However, with this paradigm, we are able to merge that, to break those lines, those traditional barriers down between these various human disciplines, and show how they join together. So, for example, what I sometimes talk about in these programs, in my interviews, is that the alternative, when I say alternative from the mainstream science, where you do have religion, you do have philosophy and metaphysics, paranormal, parapsychology. The attempt has always been to try to draw mainstream physicists and invite them in to that arena and say, will you please come and play here? But they have no compulsion to do so. There's no profit in it for them to do so. With this principle, it's the opposite. I can take these principles and go to their arena and enter their ring on their home turf, and by their own house rules, give them a bloody nose.
Interesting. It is a real mergence of sort of science, physics and spirituality, and it's lovely to see more people actually putting this together and vocalizing it so articulately. To be honest with you, I don't know really which direction to go with this, Thomas, because it's such a broad and technical subject matter. Would you please be so kind as to furnish me with any further information you feel might be valuable?
Oh, absolutely. And this is very common in my interviews, that even after 2 or even 3-hour interviews, the host will comment, my goodness, there's so many things that we can address with this. We've just simply scratched the surface. But one of the aspects of my work, of my theory, and this is very important for the layperson to understand, what distinguishes a theory or a philosophy or a metaphysical or philosophical speculation from what is called, quote unquote, a scientific theory, is that scientific theories make predictions about certain natures or certain qualities of reality that are experimentally testable. This is what separates a scientific theory from any other kind of reckoning or theorizing. For example, Albert Einstein came up with his special theory of relativity, but it wasn't anything that could be used or applied as a firm scientific principle unless there was a prediction, at least one prediction that would be made by that theory that could be tested experimentally. And the most famous aspect of his theory was the idea that space is bent around all physical objects. His idea of the continuous spatial field, which superseded science's understanding that was based previously on Newtonian physics. The Isaac Newton model of space, which was an empty void that was occupied by physical content. Einstein said, no, space is it is a substantial field that is characterized and defined by 4 independent variables: height, width, depth, and time. And so consequently, because it is substantial, in the presence of large objects, it bends around it. Now, when you bend space, light waves that are traveling through it will be equally bent across the geometric lines that are curved from this bending. So what Einstein predicted was this. He said that if we were able, during a solar eclipse, a full solar eclipse, to take photographs of the sky, when the eclipse becomes full, the sky will darken, and as we all know, you begin to see the starlight coming through during the day, where you can actually see the stars surrounding the solar disk. He predicted that within a certain region beyond the solar disk, that the light waves from distant stars would be bent a total of 1.75 degrees. He was very precise with his math. And he said, take a photo of that sky and then compare it to photos of the identical portion of the sky without the solar disk being there. And so when that experiment was finally done, when they had a good enough eclipse, and I think it took close to 19 or 20 years that Einstein waited for somebody to do this, they took the photos with solar eclipse there, compared it to the same photography of that same area of the sky without the solar eclipse, and Einstein's prediction was proven. His was a scientific theory. What my theory does is make certain predictions about the characteristics of reality. This is what separates it from everything else that's come in these fields, in these kinds of fields before. One of the predictions it makes is that the early part of the Big Bang of the universe was superluminal. In other words, the first portions of the Big Bang were beyond and above the speed of light. When that creation became subluminal, when it decelerated enough to enter the speed of light and below, it was a large ring, kind of like what I envision as a smoke ring. And so I call the beginning of the universe the Big Puff, rather than the Big Bang. And what it predicts is that the early universe would have experienced this incredible degree of expansion that would not be able to be explained in a physical way. And that's exactly what astrophysicists have found. They don't understand how the early part of the universe expanded so quickly. Another thing that it predicts is that there is no such thing as a graviton. That gravity is not a force like electromagnetism or the strong and weak nuclear forces carried by bosons. Electromagnetism is carried by an electron. Two of the greatest physicists in the 19th century, James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday, assumed that gravity behaved like electromagnetism as a magnetic force. But, you know, that assumption was based on conventional thinking. If that assumption was correct, we should have been able to find a graviton, the particle of gravity that propagates as a wave. We've never been able to find it. My model predicts that there is no such thing, that the bending of space occurs without a physical cause. It's actually paranormal. Another thing that my theory predicts is that it tells us that a model of particles and their interactions would not have an expression for gravity because there is no particulate causality for gravity. And so here we have, there's been a lot of talk recently about the discovery of a particle which may or may not be the Higgs boson, which is another issue, another offshoot of my work. But this Higgs boson is supposed to fill a hole in what we call the standard model of the universe, capital S, capital M. It's what physicists have been building for decades to describe all the particles in the universe and their interactions. What most people don't know about the standard model is that it never has had, nor does it have, an expression for gravity. Gravity is completely missing out of this model. And according to my work, this would absolutely be what we would find. The standard model would work perfectly once perfected without the need for an expression for gravity, because there is no physical particulate component of gravity. So it makes these kinds of predictions. When we go into paranormal phenomena, it makes some very specific predictions. It says that what we see in the normal world are highly stable physical structures. We don't get to see the actual creational process of information materializing in physical reality until we look at paranormal phenomena. Here we see information spontaneously materializing in front of witnesses and are recorded on physical measuring devices. And so, that being the case, if my model is correct, we would be able to measure certain unexpected changes to the local physical environment when these phenomena occur. And real briefly, I know because this is kind of, I know I'm talking a lot about this.
No, it's very interesting, Thomas. Do carry on.
All right, because this is where my work relates with the paranormal.
Yes.
To put it briefly, what my model says is that matter does not bend the surrounding space. It is that the surrounding space is bent from a superphysical extension of physical reality. That it's like the information, like the superphysical astral information that we were talking about earlier. There are also processes going on in that superphysical realm that actually bend and cause pockets into the otherwise flat fabric of space-time. And it is within those pockets that matter materializes. We have it backwards. We think about a material-centric way that matter causes the bending of space. What my model says is the bending of space creates an environment in which matter, or in which energy, not energy, it creates an environment within which information drops in, and when it becomes subluminal, it materializes into physical reality automatically. It basically uses the spatial field that Einstein talks about to assemble itself according to this pre-existing order into recognizable and orderly physical structures. What that means is that at the emergence of a paranormal event in a haunted house, we would see certain characteristics of the surrounding environment that would correspond exactly to the artificial bending of space in the presence of physical content. Now, I know this sounds a little bit deep, but I'll explain exactly what I mean. Imagine space having a bubble form in it. Liken it to a rubber inner tube, an old-fashioned rubber inner tube that's got a real weak spot in it. It's got a damage in it. So when you pump it with air, that damaged spot kind of blows up like a balloon, like a big bubble. Like some of the old comical movies from a long time ago. Imagine that happening, not in the vacuum of space, but inside of a house where we have physical content like air. Let's take the air, for example. One of the things that we would see when this occurred, let's imagine a bubble of space-time swelling and expanding. We know Einstein taught us that space around that bubble is going to be crushed and bent and twisted. And if there's air inside of it, it's going to crush and bend and twist the atoms and molecules in that air. When that bending of space, and it would be, crushing and affecting the electrons that are in the surrounding air.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Now, what would happen to those electrons?
Yeah, here's what I was talking about was the predictions that this model of mine, this theoretical model would make. And so, one of the predictions that this makes is if we did have a bubble in space-time that was expanding inside of a haunted house where there was atmosphere, or what Einstein called physical content, it would crush the space around that bubble. And we know this as a fact. It would contort, compress, and crush it. Now, unlike the vacuum of outer space, in a haunted house, we have physical content. So the air molecules and atoms that are occupying that crushed space would actually be, stressed. They would be what we would call excited. And when that happens, those electrons would jump up into their higher orbits inside the atoms. And the first thing that we would see, Melanie, would be an electromagnetic field that would emerge out of thin air.
Okay, so let's give it to the layman terms. Higher orbits, electrons jump into their higher orbits. Let's give more clarity to that.
Yes, electrons, well, an atom has various areas in it that we normally call orbits. And electrons can occupy any of those bands that are, expanding out from the nucleus. We call them valences. And the funny thing about them is that there is no physical space between them. Electrons literally automatically disappear from the one orbit and reappear spontaneously in the upper orbit, in the next higher orbit. This is what is called a quantum. This is the idea where the term quantum physics came from. And so what happens, though, is when these electrons, they expend their energy, they will drop back down in their lower orbits. And as they do this, electrons can emit a couple of different things. One of the things that they can emit is heat energy. Another thing that they can emit is light energy, or photons, which are particles of light. We don't fully understand the mechanics of this, we just know that it's true. And so today in our modern world, we exploit this effect all the time. We pass an electromagnetic field through a physical material, excite the electrons in the atoms in that material. When they drop back down from their excitement into their lower orbits, they emit photons. This is what we call, it's the basic fundamentals underneath or behind a light-emitting diode. This is why a light-emitting diode, it doesn't have a filament like an incandescent, or it doesn't have a gas in it like a fluorescent.
Yeah. Okay. So that's very interesting. Just a little bit back to the technical, physical aspects of this, because this is something that I think a lot of people need to absolutely get 100%. You were saying that the electrons can move from lower orbits into higher orbits spontaneously. So would this then be categorized as paranormal, since there's no physical sort of, does that cross over there again? This is something we see, we hear a lot in these circles, is this sort of understanding that the electrons of an atom can move between higher and lower orbital planes without appearing like they will appear in one orbit and then just reappear in another. And sometimes people, they just aren't there at all. Let's talk a little bit more about that, because there seems to be a lot of confusion as to what that actually means.
Well, it's just a known principle of electrons within the orbits of atoms, around the nucleus of an atom, is that there are various, what they call valences, or energy levels. If you can imagine, concentric circles that expand out from the middle of a nucleus of an atom. And each one of those higher circles represents a higher energy level. And so when an electron takes on a higher charge, this is kind of a layman's explanation of it.
Yeah.
What it will do is that it will jump up into one of those higher energy orbits, or those higher energy valences, further and further up away from the nucleus in the center. Now, when the electrons expend that extra energy that's caused them to jump up into these higher orbits, as they expend that extra energy, they fall back down into their lower orbits. And when electrons do this, they can emit heat energy, and they can emit photons.
Okay, yeah, yes, you said that. Okay, interesting. All right, so moving on from that, I can't remember the direction we were headed with that, but thank you for clarifying that, because for those of us who aren't so that way inclined or have that much of a knowledge of physics, I think it's important to get that. What is that actually in terms of the electrons and the atoms? What is it? Does that actually mean that sometimes those electrons can exist in other places if they are not always in those orbits? As you say, they move from one orbit to another and don't seem to sort of have a connective, tangible, way of doing that.
Well, here's one of the strange things about quantum physics, is that when these electrons move into their higher orbits or back down into their lower orbits, there is no space, literally, where they might be in between. They immediately disappear. They essentially teleport from these lower orbits to the higher ones and back to the lower ones. There is no space that they would occupy between them, because there is no space between them in a sense. It's very odd, but it's one of the characteristics of quantum physics. Now, what I was trying to do was to relate them with this model with what happens in a haunted house.
Yes.
And this is what's important about my work, because as I was talking about earlier, my theoretical model is a scientific model. Unlike other theories you may have heard, this actually makes predictions about certain characteristics of reality that are testable with experiments. So one of the experiments, quote unquote, that paranormal investigators do is they bring these electromagnetic field, these EMF meters, into sites of hauntings, and they see these electromagnetic fields emerge out of thin air. Well, this model shows exactly how that would happen. By the bending of space, it's crushing the surrounding space, which is occupied by air atoms and molecules. The electromagnetic field actually emerges from the air, from the result of the stresses that it's undergoing by being crushed by this expanding space bubble. And of course, as one of the things that these electrons can emit are photons. They're particles of light. So what I was saying is that here we have an expanded bubble of space-time inside of a haunted house, jacketed with an electromagnetic field and emitting photons. I've given the world its first scientifically relevant model of what paranormal investigators call luminous orbs.
Wow.
This is exactly what they are.
Incredible. And that makes perfect sense. It's not even that complicated.
No, that's what I try to stress to people. The concepts themselves, especially in my book, it has diagrams, and it takes great lengths to walk the reader step by step through this. The concept itself, when you grasp it, it's very simple. It has that simple elegance that Einstein believed that the final physical theory would have. He believed that it would be simple enough so a school child with a little bit of background would be able to understand it. And this theory of mine has this kind of a quality. Now, one of the other predictions it would make is that it would emit a heat signature. Now, in recent years, paranormal investigators have been taking thermal imaging cameras into the sites of hauntings and getting some interesting images. Some of them so detailed you would have to call them a thermal apparition. And yet, the characteristics of these images, and I don't think anyone had a model before where they actually observed it, where they actually noticed that when you look at these paranormal or these thermal apparitions, they don't have the same heat signature as a living creature, where there's great variations in the heat signatures between the exposed flesh and the hair, tips of the ears, clothing, on one of these paranormal images, the heat signature is uniform, more or less, across the entire image, which means that the heat generating mechanism is happening at the surface. It's not happening at the core of whatever that apparition is. This would also be consistent, a consistent prediction with my model. If a swelling of space-time occurred within physical content, again, not in the vacuum of the cosmos, but inside of a house where there was air, one of the things that would happen is that we would have a variation within barometric pressure, within the lower pressure inside the bubble and the pressure outside the bubble. These have already been documented and recorded. We would see variations in temperatures. The inside of the bubble would represent what investigators call a cold spot. And that's exactly what this would produce until the laws of equilibrium allow the outside air molecules with their contained heat energy to flow in to fill the vacuum, so that equilibrium would be reestablished. When that happens, the cold spot disappears. But one of the things that people would experience is the movement of air atoms from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure, which is a function of wind. So as the air molecules are moving into the center of the bubble to fill in the lower barometric pressure, we would feel a mystery breeze where there's no doors or windows opened.
Felt one of those today, so I know exactly what you mean by that.
You felt one of those?
Yes, I did. And I knew exactly what it was, and I was like, oh, okay, I know what that is. Who's visiting me? Okay, so that makes sense now why that would be. Or when you feel like someone's breathing on your neck and there's nobody there. They're like...
Yeah, this is what's been creating such a stir and excitement about this work in the paranormal community, because it is finally, for the first time, displayed or presented a scientifically relevant model where all of these disparate events and observations, what does an EVP have in common with an apparition or a cold spot or an electromagnetic field? And this is pulling everything together and expressing it all with a single model that if you asked any physicist versed in relativity what would happen if space got bent in the presence or inside of a house, that scientist would go right down the line explaining these exact same kinds of observations. Another thing that would happen, now remember, we know that Einstein taught us that gravity, his model of gravity, was an effect of the bending of space that created the gravitational effect. So if we have a bending of space inside of a haunted house, one of the things that we would observe would be two things. With instruments, we would be able to measure the emergence of a gravitational field on 3 axes. In other words, it wouldn't simply be a fluctuation of the unidirectional lines of gravity pointing down the center to the center of the Earth. It would be its independent own gravitational field expanding out in all directions. There's a gentleman who's a consulting associate of mine who has already conducted this experiment and found exactly this, that there's an emergence of a gravitational field on multiple axes. This was unexpected, but it is a prediction of this model. The other thing that it would explain is when on the onset of a paranormal event, many people report getting a feeling of heaviness. According to this model, that's literally true.
Yeah. For sure. Very interesting. Absolutely. It's a fascinating merger of two sort of aspects of a reality that have pretty much till now been, I think, pretty deliberately kept at opposite ends of the forum. It sort of has been taboo for the scientific academics to be going anywhere near anything sort of extraterrestrial or interdimensional or paranormal, and yet here it is pretty much virtually being proved through physics.
we are of a materialistic, or what I call absolute materialists, which many physicists are today, where they believe that every physical observation and physical effect in the universe is due to a equally physical cause that must be contained within the same universe, they wouldn't accept a superphysical extension of reality that's causing effects in our physical universe from outside. So they look out into the cosmos and they see all of this extra bending of space out in the cosmos. In fact, they see up to 90% more gravitational, what they call gravitational lensing, and gravitational effect out in the universe than there is physical matter to account for it. Very paranormal. And so an absolute materialist, though, not being able to accept an extra physical cause for any physical effect, would have to make up an imaginary physical substance to assign to it the cause for all this extra gravity. And the name for that is dark matter.
Oh. Wow. Okay, so what percentage of that would then be dark matter?
Well, according to my model, there's no such thing as dark matter.
Okay.
It's exactly why physicists cannot find it. They don't even know what it might be.
Yeah, of course. Interesting.
And what's interesting is that a number of months ago, back in the summer, astrophysicists, several astrophysicists had just completed a survey of our local region of space, the solar system and the immediate several light years around it. And they added up everything that they could find, and they found no evidence of dark matter. In other words, everything that they found all added up. There was no room for any extra imaginary, fantasized material to be there. And yet we have situations where the galaxy that we're contained in rotates at a much faster rate than all the physical content and its associated gravitational fields would dictate. So when you hear these reports of physicists saying, oh, we've mapped the locations of dark matter, what they've actually mapped is the locations of our ignorance.
I love that.
Mm-hmm. They've mapped the places where our knowledge is a vacuum.
It's kind of like when scientists say you have 90% of your DNA is junk DNA. It's not because it's junk, it's just because they can't work it out.
Yeah, and they are beginning to discover that it's not junk DNA.
Yeah.
There's much more to it than what they originally thought. Now, let's take this into another area. Let's look at parapsychology for a minute. Do you want to know about EVPs?
Yes, that sounds interesting.
All right. Because what I talk about in my book and in my work is when we're looking at the body of evidence, which we call paranormal phenomena, which only represents a component of this theory. It's unlike other people that have focused exclusively on the paranormal. I've focused on reality, and the paranormal happens to be part of that. I call what occurs in a haunted house, I divide it into primary and secondary paranormal effects. The secondary paranormal effects, Mel, is what we've been discussing. These are the changes that occur in the local environment that are measurable, and some of them unexpected but are predicted by this model, that create the environment necessary for information to drop into it and materialize. The materialization of information in paranormal activity is primary paranormal effect. So, for example, the expansion of space-time and creating that bubble is secondary. That's creating the environment. When the information about the construction of an entire human being drops down into it, falls below the speed of light, and begins to materialize, that bubble takes on the exact geometric shape of that materializing information, and then we see an apparition. And that's primary paranormal effect. So imagine we had a vocalization, which is, again, this is the beauty of this paradigm. A vocalization is a collection of coherent and meaningful information. And imagine, for example, a disembodied intelligence that tried to speak. And of course, it doesn't have any vocal cords. But whatever's going on in its intelligent matrix, its intelligent network, its blueprint, would be the same kinds of information processing that is going on in our physical brains when we go to speak. We don't have to think about moving every muscle or moving every synapse, and it just happens by the nature of the order in which it's made. Well, if a disembodied intelligence was thinking this vocalization, and that information fell down into that bubble and began to materialize, the surface of that bubble would begin to oscillate and vibrate according to the frequency and amplitude of the materializing information within it. Now, this could do two things. One of the things it could do is create, at a high energy level, would create an acoustic wave where the actual surface of the bubble itself is agitating the air column instead of a set of vocal cords. And of course, that vibration at that frequency and amplitude dictated by that vocalizing information would travel to our eardrums or a recording mic and would be translated into sound, and we would hear a voice come out of thin air. Because the very surface of space-time itself is acting like a speaker. Now, at a lower energy level, we wouldn't get an acoustic effect. But remember, our bubble is jacketed by an electromagnetic field. So when the bubble begins to take on the oscillating vibrations of the materializing vocalization, the bubble begins to project an electromagnetic impression wave, which is vibrating at the frequency and amplitude of the materializing vocalization. It's almost like an effect that they taught us in science class, where they put the tuning forks of the same pitch on the opposite ends of the room, and they were connected to hollow boxes, and they would ring one, and it would induct itself onto the other tuning fork and would begin to ring that one.
Yeah.
Similar to that. So here we have an electromagnetic frequency that's oscillating at the correct frequency and amplitude, much like the electromagnetic signal that would be transmitted from the needle cartridge into the device of a modern phonograph that was picking up the vibrations off of the vinyl platter. It enters into a dynamic microphone. It bypasses the diaphragm, the acoustic diaphragm, because remember, we're not talking right here about an acoustic wave. So it bypasses the acoustic diaphragm of the microphone. Now, in a dynamic microphone, that acoustic diaphragm is connected to a copper coil. And that copper coil is surrounded by an electromagnet. So when that acoustic diaphragm moves, it moves the coil back and forth inside the magnet and creates the electromagnetic compression wave that's translated by the device into meaningful sound. But in an EVP, this electromagnetic compression wave does not touch the acoustical diaphragm. In fact, you could take an X-Acto knife and remove the acoustic diaphragm. It won't matter. It induces itself directly onto to the coils like an antenna. It doesn't move the coils. So the surrounding magnet plays no role in this. You could remove the magnet out of the dynamic microphone and this would still work. And the induced electromagnetic field on those coils gets transferred into the machine, into the device. And when you play it back, you hear a voice where no one standing around audibly heard it because it was not an acoustic compression wave. Okay. So this model explains all these different phenomena with the same simple concept. Now, Here's the experimental work that this gentleman, David Rountree, physicist, had done in the study of the paranormal. Years ago, he did this. He and I didn't know of each other. He put a recorder inside of a vacuum and still picked up EVPs. He surgically removed the acoustic diaphragm out of a microphone and still picked up EVPs. So his experiments proved this model. And it's unprecedented. It's as far beyond the current state of understanding in this field as Newton was to Aristotle.
Okay.
Now, I was about to explain something else. What was I going to talk about?
You were going in a different direction earlier.
Yeah, I pulled this back to the EVPs because everybody's fascinated by that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I wanted to demonstrate that this has, oh yes, I remember. I wanted to demonstrate that, this explains all these phenomena with the same model. Now let's go into parapsychology. And let's look at something that most people understand, at least the definition of it and what they're familiar with it, is with remote viewing.
Yeah.
Okay? Now the government, our government, the Russian government, and I bet a lot of other governments, did a lot of experiments with remote viewing. They knew there was something to it. Of course, all these governments say, well, we're no longer doing those experiments, but, I wonder, one of the experiments that was done, this has been tested in private laboratories too, is that this remote viewing effect is not carried, the information is not carried to the remote viewer by any physical conduit. It's not carried by an electromagnetic wave. It's not carried by a light wave. It's not carried by any wire or optical fiber. Because they've encased remote viewers inside what they call Faraday cages, which eliminate any kind of electromagnetic field getting to the remote viewer. And yet this information comes to them sometimes in remarkable, striking accuracy. Now, imagine a location or an event remote, thousands of miles away. That whole event and everything that's involved in it is a materialization of extra physical information. From that extra physical information, the entire event could be reconstructed in high accuracy. If a remote viewer sees a red car, that red color is a part of the physiology. It's part of the physical characteristics of that automobile. And yet the information which makes the car and makes it red is not physical. So somehow it's transmitted outside, above space-time. It bypasses space and it bypasses time, and all of the limitations that space and time puts on information drops down into the arena of the human brain. Now, as it's coming into the human brain, we know the physical materialization of thought can be observed in electrochemical patterns in the brain. And each quality of thought has a different electrochemical pattern. So as that information falls down into the arena of the human brain, it begins to materialize as its own unique electrical chemical signature. So that the electrochemical component to the brain is almost like the brain creating a physical body for the information that's coming down into it.
Incredible. Wow. So it is really there. I mean, I have actually physically met somebody, former CIA agent in Zurich, who was teaching remote viewing, and one of the people who actually happened to be at this particular seminar with him was a very other well-known alternative media journalist, and he was telling us about how he was trained in the CIA to do what he did, and at the time he was actually prepared to teach us, and I was just wondering, how the hell is this done? And the way you've explained it now makes it absolutely perfectly clear. And one of the physical aspects of what they do is they write down a number which represents a location, put it into an envelope, and then these people would have to focus on the envelope or something to that effect. And for whatever reason, that particular number that was in the envelope represents a specific location, and they were then able to then go to with their minds and come back with the most accurate detail. And that's how these, according to what we were told, and I'm not sure how accurate it is, this is how these CIA agents were trained in remote viewing.
It makes sense. Now think about what I was talking about earlier, about the human brain having the ability to create information and materialize it. The created information would have to be consistent with the laws and principles that govern the actual construction of the convolutions and material of the brain.
Sure.
So when the experimenter assigns that site with the number 4, that experimenter is actually creating an additional piece of information that becomes linked as a continuum to the information about the remote site. So that focusing on the number that the experimenter created and added to that body of information links that number to the information that the remote viewer is seeing.
Wow. Okay. Yes. I knew this fitted into the context of what you were saying. I'm glad I brought that up. Very interesting. So basically the whole model which you've devised explains so much which we have kind of put aside because really we've gone about the wrong way, looking for physical evidence as opposed to looking at it perhaps from the other way around.
Yeah, what I try to liken it to, Mel, is think about going into a casino and playing blackjack. And we have, a deck of cards that the dealer is working from. And imagine if it is impossible for us to observe what's inside the deck of cards. Imagine further, we can't even see it. But we see the cards that get turned face up, that are dealt out on the table. Or what I would call, we see the materializations in the physical observable world of the information that's contained in that deck. Now, in the past, researchers have said, well, let me study this particular hand, or let me study this particular card that is materialized, this different segment of reality. What I'm saying is this: if we, over a long enough period of time, make observations off of all of these materializing cards that are coming to the surface and materializing as they're turned face up, and if we understand in our paradigm that there actually is a deck of cards, remember, we can't see the deck of cards. They're like coming out of like magic on the table. Imagine our paradigm finally understands. It accepts the idea that there is not only a deck of cards, but there's also an intelligent dealer controlling them. Then, when we have that paradigm, we could say, oh, now with that paradigm, we recognize that if we take an inventory of all these cards and observe them collectively as a body over a long enough period of time, it will tell us about the order and the structure and the content of what's inside the deck that we can't see, but we can only imagine it being there. And that's what this theory does.
Very, very interesting indeed. Okay, I think, Thomas, we're going to leave it there for tonight because we've covered so much information, unless there's absolutely anything else you'd like to get in before we close off.
Well, I certainly want to let the audience know where they can find out about all this.
Absolutely, please do. And also a little bit about your books and events coming up.
Yes, we're all the information about my book and my work, description of the book, all the different radio appearances I'll be on and have been on, related articles that are posted about the work, and of course the link where to order the book itself. It's available through Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble, But the best price is going to go through the website and buy it direct from our distributor, which we have a special discount code that you enter and get the best price on the internet on it. All of that can be found at www.cosmicveil, spelled V-E-I-L, cosmicveil.com.
Brilliant. All right then, and your books?
Well, we have, right now, I have Behind the Cosmic Veil, the one that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. I'm working on a couple of other ones. One of them has to do with the multiverse, or actually the lack thereof. The working title is called The Multiverse Conspiracy.
Okay.
And other techniques by science to destroy everything that is spiritual.
This is Michio Kaku's come out with that multiverse theory, hasn't he?
Oh yeah, boy, and he's making all kinds of money, and most of the things that he says makes absolutely no sense scientifically. It is mostly all philosophical speculation, and there's nothing testable about what he's talking about, but it's got this ooh and ah thrill kind of exciting sound that people say, yeah, that sounds cool, yeah, that makes sense. And in reality, when you start putting it together, a lot of what he's talking about is absolute nonsense. To a physicist, they would understand that it's nonsense. But you mentioned events. I'm going to be, at the end of the month, beginning of November, I've been invited to a VIP, invitation-only, alternate science think tank called Mission Open Discussion. That's going to be held up in the state of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. I've been invited to speak there. And I will also be speaking and presenting at the Spirits, Shadows, and Secrets International Symposium to be held in Edinburgh, Scotland in August and early September of 2013. It will include keynote speakers like Eric von Däniken. We'll also have Marie Jones there, Richard Dolan, Micah Hanks, all kinds of people from all those different areas, and I've had the honor to be invited to present there.
Fantastic, Thomas. Do you know what? We might actually make it up there, and would love to interview in person.
Oh, that would be a lot of fun. And you'll see how I explain this. The organizers asked me, well, what do you need? You know, we can provide projectors and this and that, whatever. I said, I don't do PowerPoint. I said, just give me a lot of whiteboards, a big eraser, and a couple of markers.
Good old-fashioned teaching. And that's the way I like it too. Absolutely. All right. Thomas, it's actually, I know we've had a few interruptions and I will edit them out so you won't even notice them, but this has been just very surprisingly insightful interview, and I think what amazes me is maybe I'm a little bit hard on myself, and that I am automatically block off when it comes to anything physics and science related, just simply because I think I had bad teachers in high school. But it actually isn't that complicated. I think we've been programmed to believe that we're too stupid to grasp these things when they actually aren't that difficult.
Well, yeah, and the other problems is that, of course, any field of higher education perpetuates its image and increases its value by becoming esoteric so that no one else can understand its internal language. You know, so this is one of the problems. And the other problem is that, you know, we've been looking at minutia. We're out there, you know, splitting particles into tinier and tinier pieces, and we're picking up more components than we knew of the universe. But you know, it's not telling us anything more about where the universe came from and why we see everything that we see.
Yeah. Okay. All right then, Thomas, thank you very much for your time this evening. And do you know what? I would actually love to speak to you again and get some more of your wonderfully insightful information. And hopefully we'll see you next year.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Melanie, thanks for having me on the show, and I appreciate it very much. And I had a great time. Glad to be here.
Brilliant. And we'll speak again soon, Thomas. You take care. Thanks for the info.
You too, Melanie.
Cheers then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.